I have been hosting Christmas for 6 years. I want to start there because the 6 years matter. And because the specific shape of what I am about to tell you only makes sense if you understand that I have been doing it while knowing, for 2 of those 6 years, what I am going to tell you now. 30 people. Our house. My table, which is actually 3 tables pushed together because 30 people do not fit at one table, covered with the specific cloth I iron every November in preparation, and set every Christmas Eve with the glasses that were my grandmother's and the candles that are mine. I have done this 6 times. Each time I have planned the food from the 1st of December, and sent the messages about dietary requirements by the 10th, and done the shopping across 3 days and cooked across 2, and set the table on the morning of the 25th. Each time the room has been full of people I love and people I have learned to love, and people I am still learning. My name is Rachel. I am 36 years old. My husband is Liam, 39. We have been married for 8 years. We have 2 children, a son named Joe, who is 7, and a daughter named Faye, who is 4. Liam's mother is Margaret. She is 67. She has been coming to the Christmas dinner for 6 years. For 2 of those 6 years I have known what she has been saying about me when I am not in the room. I have known, specifically, that she has been telling members of this family, and members of her own social circle, that I trapped Liam into the marriage. That I knew what I was doing. That he could have done better. That the pregnancy was convenient. That I moved fast and I knew what I was doing when I moved fast. I have been setting the table with my grandmother's glasses for 2 years while knowing this. I have been ironing the cloth while knowing. I have been sending the dietary requirement messages in December while knowing. I have been building something while knowing. Not a case, exactly. Not a plan for a specific moment. A record. A quiet and patient record of what I knew, and how I knew it, and the full shape of what had been said and to whom. I had been building it because I had learned, in 36 years of being a person who watches things carefully, that the moment you need a record is rarely the moment you build it. You build it before. You build it while you are ironing the cloth and sending the December messages. You build it at the Christmas table for 2 years. And then, when the moment arrives, it is already built. Let me tell you how I found out. Because the finding out is the beginning of the record, and it is important. I found out from Claire. Claire is Liam's sister. She is 34. She has been in my corner since the first Christmas, and she is the person in this family who tells me the things she believes I deserve to know, delivered directly and without embellishment, and with the specific directness of someone who has decided that honesty is the only navigable position. Claire told me on a Thursday in November, 2 years before the 6th Christmas. We had met for lunch. She had ordered and then she had said, "I need to tell you something." I had said, "Yes." She had said, "I want you to hear it from me rather than someone else." I had said, "Okay." She had said, "Mum has been saying things." She had told me the shape of it. That Margaret had, over the course of the year, said on several occasions to different people within and adjacent to the family that she believed Rachel had moved deliberately. That she believed the pregnancy had been strategic. That she believed Liam could have found better if he had been given the time. Claire had told me the specific occasions she knew about. A conversation with their Aunt Helen at Easter. A conversation with Margaret's friend Joanna at the book club in March. A conversation with their brother Michael's wife, Lavra, at a birthday lunch in September. Claire had said, "I am telling you because I think you should know." She had said, "I am not telling you to make you angry." She had said, "I am telling you because the not knowing is worse." I had said, "How long has she been saying it?" Claire had said, "I think since the beginning." I had said, "Since the beginning." She had said, "I think she had a view from very early on, and I think the view has been consistent." She had said, "I am sorry, Rachel." I had said, "Thank you for telling me." I had said, "I need some time with this." She had said, "Yes." She had said, "I know." She had paid for lunch. I had driven home. I had not told Liam. I want to explain why I did not tell Liam. I did not tell him because I needed to understand what I was holding before I gave it to him to hold. I needed to understand the full shape of it. What had been said, to whom, over how long, and with what consistency. I needed to understand whether what Claire had reported was the full picture or a part of a larger picture. I needed, in short, to build the record before I could share it. If I had told Liam on the Thursday after the November lunch, I would have been handing him a partial and unverified account of something he would not have been able to verify himself, about his mother in the specific way that accounts of this kind can be dismissed or minimized by the person most invested in dismissing or minimizing them. I needed the full account. I needed to build it before I shared it. I built it for 2 years. The building of the record. I want to tell you what this involved because I've been asked, since the Christmas that I am about to describe, whether I was planning a confrontation, and the answer is, not exactly. I was not planning a confrontation. I was preparing for the possibility that a confrontation might become necessary. And I was ensuring that if it did, I would have everything I needed for it to be accurate rather than emotional. There is a difference between those two things. An accurate confrontation is one that is built on verified information delivered clearly. An emotional confrontation is one that is built on accumulating feeling delivered at pressure. I have been in both kinds of room and I know which one produces a real outcome. The record I built over 2 years consisted of the following. First, Claire's account, which I had asked her to write down in a message to me the week after the November lunch, so that I had the specific wording rather than my recollection of her account. She had sent it. I have kept it. Second, the conversation with Liam's Aunt Helen at a family gathering 6 months after the November lunch, in which Helen had mentioned, in the course of a warm and friendly conversation, that she had spoken to Margaret about Rachel and Liam's early years and that she had been surprised by Margaret's view. She had not elaborated. I had said, gently, "What was her view, if you don't mind me asking?" Helen had said, "She seemed to feel the pregnancy was quick." She had said, "I told her I thought you were very well matched, and that the timing of a pregnancy is no one's business but the couple's." I had said, "Thank you, Helen." I had noted the conversation in a note on my phone that evening. Helen. Date. The word quick. Third. A message I had received in January of the 2nd year from Lavra, Michael's wife, who had become a friend over the years and who had said, in the context of a longer message about something else, "I want you to know that I said something to Michael about what Margaret has been saying, and Michael was not aware of it, and he was not comfortable with it." She had not elaborated on what Margaret had been saying. She had not needed to. I had noted the message. The 3 pieces together gave me the full shape. It was not one conversation or one occasion. It was a consistent view, shared consistently across at least 3 separate conversations over at least 2 years, with at least 3 different people. That is not a slip. That is not an unguarded moment. That is a held position, shared as a position, across a significant portion of the family social landscape. I had the record. By the November before the 6th Christmas, I had the record and I had been holding it for 2 years, and I had been setting the table and sending the December messages and ironing the cloth. I had been hosting Margaret at my table for 2 Christmases while holding the record. And in the 2nd of those 2 years, at the 6th Christmas, the moment arrived not because I chose it but because Margaret, at the table, said something about me within my hearing, and within Claire's hearing, and the moment was already built and I was already standing in it. The 6th Christmas. I want to give you the full evening because the full evening is the record, and I do not want to give you only the table moment without the hour that preceded it. which had its own texture and which is part of the account. Drinks before dinner. 30 people across our living room and our kitchen and the hallway in between. The children running. Faye wearing the Christmas dress she had chosen herself in November, and which had sequins on the front, that she had been describing to every arriving guest since the first one. Joe explaining to his cousin something about a video game at considerable length. The specific warm noise of 30 people in a house that is the right size for 12. I was in the living room with a glass of wine, and my brother Paul, talking about something I cannot now remember, but which felt important at the time, when I became aware of Margaret across the room. She was in the corner by the bookshelf with Liam's Aunt Helen. The corner is far enough from where I was standing that I could not hear the conversation. I could see Margaret's face. I have been watching Margaret's face in this house for 8 years, and I know its registers. The register I was looking at across the room was the one I had first identified 3 years ago, the register of the private communication. The one she uses when she is sharing information she believes to be significant with someone she trusts. She was speaking, and Helen was listening, and I was watching, and I had been watching that register for 3 years, and I knew what it meant. I excused myself from Paul. I crossed the room. Not quickly. Not with any visible purpose other than movement through a room full of people. I reached the corner. I said, "Margaret." I said it warmly. She turned. Helen turned. I said, "I want to introduce you to my mother." My mother was nearby. I brought her over. I said, "Mum, this is Liam's mum, Margaret." My mother said, "Oh, I've heard so much about you." She said it with the warm openness she brings to every new person she meets. Margaret said, "All good, I hope." My mother said, "Rachel tells me you've been wonderful since the wedding." Margaret said, "Oh, I always try." I looked at Margaret. She looked at me. There was a specific quality in the half-second of that look. She knew that I had crossed the room. She knew I had seen her face from across the living room. She did not know whether I had understood what I had seen. I said, "I am so glad we have had these years to build something." I said it warmly. I said it with a smile. I said it in the specific tone of someone who is leaving a door open rather than walking through it. She said, "Yes." She said, "Absolutely." My mother and Margaret spoke about the children for a few minutes. Then Liam called from the kitchen that dinner was nearly ready. The room began its migration toward the tables. I refilled my glass. I said, quietly, to Claire, who was beside me. She was telling Helen something in the corner. Claire looked at me. She said, "Yes." She said, "I know." I said, "It will be okay." Claire said, "I know it will." We went into dinner. Liam's brother Michael stood at his chair and said, "Before we sit, I want to say something." He said, "To Rachel, who has done this 6 times running and who does it better every year." He said, "And to the fact that this family, with all of its noise and its various opinions, still manages to sit at the same table every December." He said, "And to the fact that we are still speaking." He raised his glass. The room raised their glasses. I raised mine. Margaret raised hers. She smiled. The smile was the managed one. I noted it. We sat down. The table moment. I want to give it to you exactly in the order it happened, because the order matters. We were 20 minutes into the main course. The roast was good. The vegetables were exactly as I had planned them. The room was warm with the specific warmth of 30 people who have eaten together many times, and who know the rhythms of each other around food. Liam was at the head of the table. I was 2 seats from Margaret. Claire was directly across from Margaret. The conversation was general and easy, the kind of Christmas table conversation that moves through topics at the speed of 30 people. The children's school news, a news story someone had read that week, something about a flight delay, something about someone's new kitchen. And then Margaret said something. She said it quietly to Helen, who was beside her. I caught it in the way you catch the thing you have been listening for without knowing you are listening. She said, "Well, she has certainly made herself at home." She said, "You have to give her that." I heard it. Claire heard it. The conversation at the nearby end of the table continued. And underneath it Claire said, "I'm sorry. What was that, Margaret?" Margaret said, "I was just talking to Helen." Claire said, "I thought I heard you say something about Rachel." Margaret said, "I was just saying she has made herself at home." Claire said, "Yes," she said, "she has." She said, "She hosts 30 people every Christmas." She said, "She has done it for 6 years." She said, "That is what making yourself at home looks like." And then I said, "Margaret." She looked at me. I said, "I want to say something." I said, "I have been hosting this table for 6 years." I said, "I have been married to Liam for 8 years." I said, "I love this family and I love this table." I said, "And I have known for 2 years that you have been telling people in this family that I tricked Liam into marrying me." The table went quiet, not a crashing quiet, a soft and specific quiet, the quiet of a room that has collectively understood that something real is happening and is giving it space. I said, "I know about the conversation with Claire in October 3 years ago." I said, "I know about the conversation with Helen at Easter 2 years ago." I said, "I know about what you said to your book club in March." I said, "I am not going to give you the details in front of everyone, because this is Christmas dinner, and the food is good and the family is here." I said, "But I need you to know that I know." I said, "And I need Liam to know that I know." I looked at Liam. He was very still. He had put down the carving knife. I said, "I should have told you sooner." He said, "How long?" I said, 2 years. He said, "You have been holding this for 2 years." I said, "Yes." He said, "At this table?" I said, "Yes." He looked at Claire. He said, "Claire." She said, "I told Rachel 2 years ago." She said, "I thought she deserved to know." He said, "Yes." He looked at his mother. He said, "Mum," 1 word, 1 flat, clear syllable. The table was very quiet. The gravy boat was still on the table. The candles were lit. 30 people. Margaret said, "I only said what I believed." Liam said, "You said I could have done better." She said, "I thought..." He said, "No." He said, "I need you to hear this." He said, "You thought, in private conversations with my family and at your book club, about my wife, and none of what you said was true, and none of it was said to my face or to hers." He said, "At her table." He said, "In her house." He said, "On Christmas." He said, "I need you to hear what that is." He looked at me. He said, "You have been hosting this table while knowing." I said, "Yes." He said, "For 2 years?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Why did you not tell me?" I said, "Because I was building something." He said, "What were you building?" I said, "The knowledge." I said, "The certainty." I said, "I needed to know for myself that I knew before I could give it to you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." He said, "I understand that." He looked at Margaret. He said, "Mum." He said, "I'm going to say one thing tonight." He said, "This is the last Christmas you come to this table if you continue to hold the view that my wife is not the right person for me." He said, "You can hold the view." He said, "But the view and this table are not compatible." He said, "The view is yours." He said, "The table is also ours." He said, "You need to choose what to do with each of them." She looked at the table. She said, "Liam." He said, "Yes." She said, "I will not say those things again." He said, "That is the first step." He said, "The second step is understanding why they were wrong." He said, "I would like you to think about the second step." He said, "We can discuss it when it is not Christmas with 30 people." He said, "But I need the first step tonight." She said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you." He picked up the carving knife. He said, "The roast is getting cold." The room exhaled. The conversation began again, not immediately, but within a minute, in the specific way that rooms return to themselves when a thing has been said clearly and has not been left to fill all the available space. I reached for the wine bottle. I refilled Claire's glass. I refilled Helen's glass. I refilled Liam's glass. I refilled my own. I refilled Margaret's glass last. I poured it at the same level as every other glass. Normally. Without comment. She looked at her glass. She looked at me. She said, "Thank you." I said, "Of course. That is also the record. That is also mine. The days after Christmas. I want to give you the 27th first, which is when Liam and Margaret had their conversation, and then the call from my mother, which is the other thing I want you to have. The 27th. Liam had called Margaret and asked if she could come over. She had come. I had been in the house and I had gone to the kitchen while they talked in the sitting room, because it was Liam's conversation to have, not mine. He told me about it afterward. Sitting at the kitchen table at the end of the evening, with the same completeness he had been giving me since we first met. The whole thing, in order, without softening. He had said, "I want to understand how you arrived at this view." She had said, "I had a feeling from the beginning." He had said, "What feeling?" She had said, "That it happened quickly." He had said, "We were together for 3 years before the pregnancy." She had said, "I know." He had said, "The timeline was ours." She had said, "I know that." He had said, "So the feeling was from a different source than the timeline." She had been quiet. He had said, "What was the source?" She had said, "I was not ready for you to be someone's husband yet." He had been quiet. Then he had said, "You were not ready." She had said, "I know how that sounds." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "It sounds like you built a story about my wife out of your own unreadiness." She had said, "I built a story from a feeling." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "The story was wrong." She had said, "I know." He had said, "And you shared it." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "With Claire and Helen and Lara and the book club." She had said, "Yes." He had said, "Mum." He had said, "That is 2 separate things." He had said, "The feeling is yours to have." He had said, "The sharing of the story built from the feeling is something else." He had said, "The first is human." He had said, "The second is a choice." He had said, "I need you to understand both." She had said, "I understand both." He had said, "I need you to understand specifically that the choice harmed Rachel." She had said, "I understand." He had said, "She sat at her own table for 2 years while knowing." She had said, "I know." He had said, "She ironed the tablecloth for 2 years while knowing." She had been quiet for a moment. Then she had said, "That is very hard to sit with." He had said, "Yes." He had said, "And I would like you to sit with it." He had said, "There will not be a formal apology required at this table." He had said, "What is required is the understanding that it is something to sit with, and the decision to sit with it honestly." She had said, "I will." He had said, "Good." He had said, "I love you, Mum." She had said, "I know." She had said, "I love you too." She had left. He had come to the kitchen. He had told me all of it. He had sat at the table. He had said, "She was not ready for me to be someone's husband." I said, "I know." He said, "The story came from that." I said, "Yes." He said, "She was wrong." I said, "Yes." He said, "I told her she was wrong." I said, "I know." He said, "I am glad the record existed." I said, "Yes." He said, "I'm glad you built it." I said, "It needed to be there before the moment, not after." He said, "Yes." He said, "It was exactly that." He said, "Rachel." I said, "Yes." He said, "Thank you for not telling me before the moment." He said, "I know that is a strange thing to thank you for." He said, "But the 2 years of building gave you something I did not have." He said, "You walked into the table moment with certainty." He said, "I walked into it without preparation, and I was still able to respond because you were certain." I said, "Yes. The certainty was yours." I said, "It was 2 years of ironing." He said, "Yes." He said, "That is also preparation." I said, "Yes." My mother called the next morning. She said, "I need to tell you something." She said, "You handled it perfectly." She said, "Perfectly." She said, "You said what needed to be said, and then you picked up the wine bottle." I laughed. She said, "That is the whole art." She said, "Say the thing and then fill the glasses." She said, "Never let the thing be the last thing." She said, "Let the filled glasses be the last thing." I said, "Yes." She said, "I am very proud of you." She said, "The cloth was beautiful, by the way." She said, "The way you iron it." I said, "Thank you." She said, "Your grandmother would have been pleased." I said, "Yes." She said, "Go and enjoy the rest of Christmas." I said, "Yes." She said, "I love you." I said, "I love you too." Where things are now. It is nearly a year since the 6th Christmas. The 7th Christmas is in 3 weeks. Margaret is coming. I have sent the dietary requirement messages. I have the cloth ironed. I have planned the food. I want to tell you about the book. Margaret arrived at our house in October with a gift for me. Not for the children. Not for Liam. For me. She handed it to me at the door. She said, "I found something I thought you would like." The gift was wrapped in brown paper, simply, with a piece of green ribbon. I opened it. It was a cookbook. Not a general cookbook. A specific one, by a writer whose name I had mentioned once at a dinner in our house 3 years ago. I had been talking about food writing. I had said a name. I had said, "She writes about food in the way I try to cook it." I had said, "She understands what a kitchen is for." I had said it once, 3 years ago, in passing, in the middle of a dinner where the conversation had been on 6 different topics. Margaret had been at that dinner. She had been listening. She had kept the name. She had found the book. She had wrapped it in brown paper with green ribbon, and she had brought it in October. I said, "How did you know about this book?" She said, "You mentioned her once." She said, "At one of the dinners." She said, "I was listening." I looked at her. I said, "Thank you, Margaret." She said, "I hope it is good." She said, "I thought it might be the kind of thing you would like." I said, "I know it will be." She said, "Good." She went to find Liam. I stood in the hallway with the book. "I want to tell you what I thought." I thought, she has been listening for 3 years and using what she heard for a purpose. And the purpose has changed. The purpose was once to build a picture. The purpose is now to find a book. The listening is the same. The direction of it is different. I'm not making a large claim about what this means. I'm noting that it happened, and that I noted it. The book is on the kitchen shelf. Beside it is a folder. The folder contains the record I built over 2 years. Claire's message, the note about Helen, the message from Lavra. 3 items. 3 pieces of evidence for something that has already been named and addressed. The folder does not need to be used again. I have not thrown it away. I have not decided to throw it away. I keep records. The folder and the book are on the same shelf. They coexist. That is where things are. I am going to tell you one more thing. The cloth. The Christmas cloth. I ironed it last week. It takes 45 minutes. I do it every November, and I have done it every November for 8 Christmases. And I will do it again next November for the 9th. While I was ironing it last week, I thought about the 2 years of ironing while knowing, and I thought about what my mother had said. The whole art is to say the thing and then fill the glasses. I thought about filling Margaret's glass last. I thought about the book on the shelf. I thought about the folder on the shelf beside it. I thought about Faye in her sequined dress asking every arriving guest to look at her. I thought about Joe explaining something about video games at considerable length. I thought about Liam at the head of the table putting down the carving knife. I thought about 30 people and 1 cloth. I ironed the cloth. It took 45 minutes. It is ready. Here is my question for you. If you had been holding a 2-year record at your own table, and the moment arrived not because you chose it, but because your male said something you could hear, would you have spoken at the table or waited for a private conversation? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. I want to tell you about Claire. Because Claire is the reason the record exists, and Claire has been in this account from the first paragraph, and I have not yet given her the full account she deserves. Claire is 34 years old. She has been my sister-in-law for 8 years and my friend for approximately the same length of time. She told me the truth in November because she decided I deserved to have it. She did not tell me to cause trouble. She did not tell me to start something. She told me because she is the kind of person who believes that the people she loves should have the full picture and not withholding. The full picture is a form of disrespect dressed up as protection. I have thought about that a lot over 2 years. The withholding as protection instinct is one I understand. I had it myself. I did not tell Liam for 2 years. But I was withholding in order to build, not in order to protect. Claire's alternative, which was to give me the full picture and trust me to build from it, was the right call. I want to say this clearly because Claire was in a difficult position. She was telling her brother's wife something difficult about her own mother. She had no obligation to do it. She chose to do it because she thought it was right. I think it was right. At the Christmas table, when Liam said, "Claire," and Claire said, "I told Rachel 2 years ago," I thought she deserved to know. Liam looked at her for a moment. He said, "Yes," he said, "she did." Claire looked at me. I looked at Claire. She raised her glass, very slightly, at her side. Not a toast. Just, "I see you." I raised mine. That is also part of the record. That is also mine. The full account includes Claire raising her glass at her side, in the specific way of someone who has been on the right side of a thing and knows it. That is everything. That is the whole story.